Sometimes the worst weed on your property isn't caused by wind, birds, or an abandoned neighbor's field. Sometimes it is brought home in a small pot. It looks neat, smells nice, is inexpensive, and seems so useful that it is simply impossible to see any threat in it. They plant it near a fence, near a garden bed, next to a greenhouse, or under an old apple tree, and then for several seasons they almost forget about it because at first it really behaves calmly. But a year later, everything changes. The strawberries begin to disappear under alien leaves. Young seedlings grow weaker, although the watering has not changed. Shoots appear between the boards of the path that were not there yesterday. And when the owner takes a shovel and tries to remove the excess, not just one root comes out of the ground, but a whole network, going in different directions, as if the plant had long been building its own map under the site. And it is at this moment that an unpleasant understanding comes. The problem didn't start today. It started on the day of landing. The most dangerous plants in the garden rarely look dangerous in the first weeks. They are not always poisonous, they are not always prickly, and they are not always weed-like. Many of them are beautiful, fragrant, edible, or even medicinal. The danger begins when their biology turns out to be stronger than the boundaries that humans have not set for them. The first group of such plants can be called underground invaders. They are in no hurry to win from above. They do not always immediately shade the bed and do not necessarily look aggressive. Their main strength lies below the surface, in the rhizomes, tubers, suckers, and underground shoots that slowly take up space until one sees only the green top. The most familiar example is mint. She is rarely imprisoned with fear. Usually the opposite happens. A person wants fresh leaves for tea, a little aroma near the house, a small green corner that will be pleasant to touch with your hand. Mint seems to be an ideal plant. Unpretentious, healthy, lively, and quickly restored after cutting. But it is precisely this power that makes her dangerous. Mint spreads by underground shoots that easily spread beyond the designated area. Today, she occupies a small circle near the path, and after 2 seasons she already appears among the vegetables, under the bushes, and in those places where no one invited her. Each new shoot appears to be a separate plant, but in fact it is part of one expanding system. Therefore, mint cannot be considered an ordinary green for free planting. It is best to keep it in a container, in a buried limiter, or in a place where its expansion will not be a problem. Otherwise, a plant that started out as a tea gradually becomes a constant weeding plant. A similar story happens with horseradish. It comes to the site like a seasoning, like a tradition, like a strong root that supposedly should grow somewhere in the far corner and not bother anyone. But horseradish doesn't just grow. It is fixed. Its root goes deep, and if when digging up at least part of a living fragment remains in the ground, the plant can come back again. This is why fighting horseradish often becomes a strange, repetitive ritual. A person digs it up in the fall, sees new leaves in the spring, digs again, leaves a piece of root again, and doesn't even notice how he turns one planting into a multi-year task. Horseradish is not a bad plant. He is useful, strong, and well deserves a place on the site. But this place should be chosen so that the plant will remain there for a long time. If planted near beds, paths, or soft cultivated soil, it will almost always take advantage of this freedom. Lily of the Valley works differently, but the results may be similar. They love him for his tenderness. In spring, it looks almost innocent. Short leaves, white bells, the smell of an old garden and childhood memories. But underneath that soft exterior is a dense system of rhizomes that can gradually take over shady areas, crowding out weaker plants. Lily of the Valley is especially dangerous because it is not perceived as a problem for a long time. It doesn't look like a weed. It would be a shame to remove it. Its bloom seems too beautiful to think about controlling. But in the garden, beauty does not replace behavior. If a plant expands its boundaries year after year, then it already controls the space. The snail is even more insidious because it often appears as an ordinary green mass, which at first they simply try to pull out with their hands. But weeding alone does not defeat the squall. Its underground rhizomes are able to remain in the soil, produce new shoots, and return after a seemingly thorough harvest. The softer and more fertile the soil, the easier it is for her to move forward. In the garden, this is especially unpleasant because it quickly occupies exactly those places where a person would like to see vegetables, berries, or flowers. Wheatgrass works even harder. It appears to be an ordinary grass, but its real power lies in its rhizomes, which run underground in long, light-colored cords. The problem with wheatgrass is that improper treatment may not kill it, but may help it spread. When a cultivator or shovel cuts the rhizomes into pieces, each living fragment can become the start of a new plant. And then the gardener finds himself in a strange situation. He goes out to fight the weed, but he himself cuts it into future colonies. This is one of the most important lessons of the entire scenario. Not every active struggle is the right struggle. Sometimes a plant wins precisely because a person reacts quickly, but does not understand the mechanism. Jerusalem artichoke completes this first group because it shows especially well the difference between a useful plant and a plant without boundaries. On the one hand, Jerusalem artichoke is edible, productive, hardy, and able to grow where many crops do worse. On the other hand, its tubers are difficult to completely remove from the ground. One missed fragment and the plant returns the next year. After a few seasons, a small row can turn into a thicket, which itself decides where the border of the bed lies. Here again, it is important to be honest. Neither mint, nor horseradish, nor lily of the valley, nor wheatgrass, nor Jerusalem artichoke are evil in themselves. Each of them has its own role, benefit, or beauty, but they all show the same law of the garden. A plant with a strong underground strategy cannot be planted as if it would respect the human plan. The garden does not lose to such plants in one day. He loses to them gradually until a person looks at the leaves and does not notice the roots. And if the first group seizes the earth from below, then the next one acts even more subtly. These plants do not always spread so quickly and do not always physically choke their neighbors. Sometimes they change the very space around them. They leave a chemical trace in the soil, in the leaves, in the residues that decompose after the season. They don't just take up space, they change the rules of the game for everyone who grows up nearby. There are plants that win space by brute force. They spread their roots, send out shoots, raise new shoots from each fragment left behind, and gradually turn the garden bed into a territory where a person is no longer the owner, but a constant cleaner. But there is another group, less obvious and therefore often more dangerous. These plants do not always look aggressive. They can stand still, not take up too much space in the first year, not crawl along paths, and not be conspicuous as weeds. Their power manifests itself in other ways, through the substances they exude from their roots, through the leaves that fall to the soil, through the residues that decompose after a season, and through the chemical trail that changes conditions for neighboring crops. This phenomenon is called allelopathy. The word itself sounds dry and scientific, but in the garden it manifests itself very simply. Next to one plant, others grow worse. Although there is enough water, there is sun, and the soil seems to have not changed. Seeds germinate weaker, seedlings develop more slowly, roots become shorter, and the gardener spends a long time looking for the cause in watering, weather, or fertilizers, although the source of the problem may be very close. One of the most famous plants of this type is wormwood. Wormwood is often thought of as the protector of the garden. Its strong scent seems beneficial, almost medicinal, and many actually use it as a plant that repels certain pests or simply creates a wild, resilient feel to the area. There is some truth to this, because it is no coincidence that wormwood has been present in folk medicine, everyday life, and traditional gardens for centuries. But its power is not limited to smell. Wormwood contains active substances that can affect the germination and early growth of other plants. This does not mean that a dead zone immediately forms around it, where nothing living survives. It would be too rude and wrong to say that. But if wormwood grows close to the beds, especially on poor or dry soil, its influence can become noticeable. Weak crops start worse, young seedlings look depressed, and the soil under the bush does not always quickly return to normal after the plant is removed. Therefore, it is better to perceive wormwood not as an ordinary ornamental grass, but as a plant with character. It can find a place on the plot, but this place should not be in the center of the vegetable system. where every meter of soil must work for the harvest. Wormwood is good where its vigor does not interfere with crops that need a soft, predictable environment to grow. Next in this group is fennel. At first glance, fennel seems to be an ideal cultivated plant. Beautiful, tall, fragrant, with lacy greens and seeds that are used in cooking. It doesn't look like an invader, which is why it is often planted too close to vegetables, without considering the fact that fennel does not fit well into a conventional mixed planting system. Many plants can be combined with each other because their roots, height, nutritional needs, and growth timing complement their neighbors. Fennel behaves differently. It often suppresses plants near it, especially if they are young or already weakened. Therefore, experienced gardeners usually give it a separate place where it can grow without close proximity to tomatoes, beans, cabbage, or other crops that should not compete with it for space and chemical environment. Again, the problem is not that fennel is bad. The problem is that it was planted like ordinary greens, although it requires special treatment. Sunflower shows this topic from a different perspective. Unlike wormwood or fennel, it doesn't appear to be secretive. He immediately becomes large, noticeable, and strong. They love it for its beauty, for its seeds, for its height, for the feeling of summer that it brings to the sight. But precisely because of this beauty, many people forget that sunflower is a powerful crop with a serious influence on the space around it. It takes up a lot of light, water, and nutrition, and its residue after the season can affect the germination of some plants. In studies, aqueous extracts and plant residues of sunflower did show an effect on the growth of other crops, although this effect depends on the concentration, soil, humidity, and what kind of plants grow after it. Therefore, the honest wording here should be calm. Sunflowers do not make the soil dead, but after dense planting they can leave the area tired, especially if all the stems, leaves, and roots are simply buried in the soil without time to decompose and recover. Planting sunflowers as a single accent or as a separate strip is one thing. If you turn the edge of your garden with it and then wonder why low crops grow worse nearby, that's a different story. Canadian goldenrod looks even more harmless because many people know it as a bright ornamental plant with yellow panicles that blooms beautifully at the end of the season and looks good against the background of a fence or an empty corner of the site. But it is these plants that often become the most unpleasant escapees. Goldenrod doesn't just grow. It is capable of forming dense thickets, crowding out native plants, and holding space for years. Its power lies not only in its seeds and root system, but also in its ability to change the conditions around it so that it is more difficult for other species to return. In nature, such plants are especially successful in occupying disturbed areas, roadsides, wastelands, abandoned areas, field edges, and places where the soil has already lost a stable plant community. In a vegetable garden or garden, this means a simple thing. If goldenrod is allowed to bloom, seed, and expand freely, it will gradually cease to be a decoration and become a background that absorbs everything around it. And here comes the important difference between a beautiful plant and a safe plant. The beautiful plant pleases the eye at the moment of flowering. A safe plant remains manageable several years after planting, and if beauty is visible immediately, then controllability is tested only by time. Allelopathic and reactive plants rarely take over an area as theatrically as mint or wheatgrass. They don't always crawl out of every crack and don't always turn weeding into a war with the roots. Their action is quieter, so the gardener notices the problem late. When for several seasons in a row the seedlings start poorly, the seeds germinate worse, or there is a strange feeling that the soil does not like certain crops. But the earth is not usually capricious without a reason. Most often there is a reason, it's just not always on the surface. And if the second group of plants changes the rules through a chemical trace, then the next group acts even more clearly and visibly. These plants do not necessarily poison their neighbors and do not always spread with rhizomes.